All right, so good evening, psychology class. So I am coming to you once again, and I am going to review chapter 12, which will be our focus for our Wednesday class. And so I'm going to review this earlier so you'll have an opportunity to review the information, to listen to the video, and possibly have a greater discussion on Wednesday. All right, so this is chapter 12. Chapter 12 picks up at 466 in your book, and it deals with 459. It deals with emotion, stress, and health, and so we'll be talking about those things today. I will have a handout available for you, and then I'll post it on the Populi as well so you can have the handout information ahead of time. All right, so just an overview of the chapter 12, emotion, stress, and health. Emotions are psychological responses that involve an interplay among psychological arousal, expressive behavior, and conscious experience. James and Lang argue that we feel emotions after we notice our bodily responses. Cannon and Brad contended that we feel emotion when our body responds. Shatter and Singer two-factor theory states that to experience emotion, we must be aroused and cognitively label the emotion. And if you remember, I've been paying attention in class, you possibly remember where we talked about before the emotion starts, there's a thought that happens before that emotion, which is the cognitive behavioral theory, that there's a thought that happens in my head, and from that thought comes an emotion, and from that emotion triggers a behavioral response. Some emotional responses are immediate, as sensory input bypasses the cortex, triggering a rapid reaction outside of our conscious awareness. Others, especially responses to complex emotions, require interpretation. Although the physical arousal that occurs with a different emotion is for the most part indistinguishable, researchers have discovered subtle differences in brain circuits, finger temperatures, and hormones. In using physiological indicators to detect lies, the polygraph does better than chance, but not nearly well enough to justify in its widespread use. Maybe not always accurate. We decipher people's emotions by reading their body language, their voices, and their faces, whether people are happy or sad. And we looked at some of this when we studied emotions in our previous chapter, from the facial expression, from the body gestures. You can tell the difference between aggression or love or sadness. Although some gestures are culturally determined, facial expressions such as the happiness and fear are universal. Facial expressions not only communicate emotion, but also amplify the felt emotion. So Carol Eisert has identified 10 basic emotions, most of which are present in infancy. This chapter examines 2 human emotions in detail, anger and happiness. Anger is most aroused by frustrating and insulting acts that seem willful, unjustified, and avoidable. Expressing anger may be temporarily calming, but in the long run, it actually arouses more anger. Happiness boosts people's perceptions of the world and their willingness to help others. However, even significant good events seldom increase happiness for long, a fact explained by the adaptation level and the relative deprivation principles. Exposure to prolonged stress can increase our susceptibility to serious illness. Health psychology provides psychology's contribution to behavioral medicines. Walter Cannon viewed our response to stress as a fight or flight response. Hans Selve saw it as a three-stage generational adaptation syndrome. Modern research assesses the health consequences of various life experiences. Stress may affect the progression of several serious illnesses, including AIDS and cancer. Coronary heart disease have been linked with the anger-prone type A personality. So several factors affect our ability to cope with stress, including our feelings of personal control, our basic outlook on life, and our supportive connections. Stress management programs include training in aerobic exercise, a meditation, prayer for the Christian believer, and relaxation. Researchers seek to identify intervening variables that may link spirituality and health. And so this is just an overview of the things that we'll cover in the chapter. So let's move to some fact or fiction questions here. Fact or falsehood? Some emotional responses involve no conscious thinking. Fact or falsehood? What do you think? The polygraph has proved to be extremely effective in detecting lies. Fact or falsehood? We'll come back and we'll revisit some of those answers in just a minute. All right, so moving on. On your handout, if you're following along with your handout, it talks about the chapter overview. So in chapter 12, we're looking at emotion, expressing emotion, stress and illness, and health and coping with life. Emotion, arousal, behavior, and cognition. Let's talk about the cognitive behavioral piece of that. Emotions are adaptive responses that support our survival. Emotional components, you got bodily arousal, expressive behaviors, conscious experiences. Emotion, arousal, behavior, and cognition. Theories of emotions generally address two major questions, right? So this is in your handout on page 1. Does psychological arousal come before or after emotional feelings? Remember we talked about the emotion, the behavior, the implementation, or the thought, the emotion, and the behavior. How do feelings and cognitions interact? So some of the questions that we'll go over. All right, and we talked a little bit about these theorists: James Lange theory, the Cannon-Barr theory, Shatner and Singer two-fact theory, arousal, label, emotion. All right, so I just gave you an overview. We're going to dive into some of these things. All right, first question that we're going to answer. Describe how arousal, cognition, and expressive behavior interact in emotion. So what is an emotion? What do you think it is? An emotion is a response of the whole organism that involves an interplay among 1. Bodily arousal, 2. Expressive behaviors, 3. Conscious experience. The James Lange theory states that our experience and our emotion is a consequence of our physiological response to an external stimulus. We are afraid because our heart pounds, say in response to an approaching stranger. The Cannon-Barr theory, on the other hand, proposes that the physiological responses and our emotional experience occur simultaneously. They occur at the same time. Heart pounding and fear occur at the same time. One does not cause the other. So two different theories: James Lange theory, Cannon-Barr theory. Explain whether we must consciously interpret or label emotions in order to experience them. All right, so looking at another theorist, Shatner and Singer had a two-fact theory of emotion. The two-fact theory focuses on an interplay of thinking and feeling, not on timing of feelings. The theory states that to experience emotions, one must be physically aroused and cognitively label the arousal. The spillover effect occurs when arousal from one event are responses to another event. Does experiments show that stirred up state can be experienced as a different emotion, depending on how we interpret or label it? Arousals fuel emotion, and cognition channels it. Emotion is created by emotion. Sometimes we experience unlabeled emotions. According to Zangak and Ledox, and I'm probably butchering their names, sensory input can follow a pathway that leads via the thalamus to the amygdala. And so you can pull out your image of the brain that we gave out a couple of weeks ago, and it'll tell where those things are located. The thalamus and the amygdala, the low road, bypassing the cortex and triggering a rapid reaction that is outside of our conscious awareness. Other more complex emotions, including hatred and love, require interpretation and are routed along the slower route, the high road, to the cortex for analysis. Automatic emotions and the importance of conscious thinking and emotion illustrate our two-track mind. Lazarus notes that cognitive appraisal always occurs, sometimes without our awareness. All right, the physiology of emotions. Different emotions have subtle indicators. Brain scans, EEGs, reveals different brain circuits for different emotions. Depression and general negativity, right frontal lobe activity. Happiness, enthusiastic and energized left frontal lobe activity. So it identified different parts in the brain where these things occur. We talked a little bit about this when we did the study on how we bring in input and it is put into long-term memory or short-term memory. So we did some work around this, so you may remember. And I just went over, can a lie detector reveal lies? In one study, polygraph experts, and I got to put on my glasses because this is microscopic print. Polygraph experts interpret the polygraph data of 100 people who had been suspects in a theft crime. Half the suspects were guilty and had confessed. The other half had been proven innocent. Had the polygraph experts been the judges, more than 1/3 of the innocent would have been declared guilty, and 1/4 of the guilty would have been declared innocent. Detecting emotions in others. People can often detect nonverbal clues and threats and signs of status. Non-threatening clues more easily detect than deceiving expressions. Westerners, firm, handshake, outgoing, expressive personalities, gaze, intimacy, averted glance, submission, a stare, dominance. Anybody ever given you the stare down? Indication of dominance. Detecting emotion in others. Gestures, facial expressions, voice tones are absent in written communication. In absence of expressive emotion, ambiguity can occur. This is what happens in many of our emails, text messages, social media, Facebook posts. We don't know what emotion is intended when people post certain things, and they slap on those little emoticons, and we assign our own level of that emotion in regards to how we're interpreting the words that's in that post. But over 70-80% of communication is lost through email, through social media, through all of those types of communication that is not face-to-face interaction. Gender emotion and nonverbal behavior. Women tend to read emotional cues more easily and to be more empathetic. Express more emotion and with their faces. I talk with my hands, my face. People attribute female emotionality to disposition and male emotionality to circumstance. All right, going back to my lecture notes. So that was just from your handout. So you can look at your PowerPoint and you can find that information. All right, describe the link between emotional arousal and the autonomic nervous system and explain how arousal affects performance. So the ANS, the autonomic nervous system, controls arousal. In an emergency, the sympathetic divisions automatically mobilizes the body for fight or flight, directing the adrenal glands to release hormones that increase the heart rate, blood pressure, and blood sugar levels. Other physical changes include dilated pupils, slowed digestion, and increased sweating. The parasympathetic nervous system division calms the body after a crisis has passed, although arousal diminishes gradually. According to the Yerkes-Dodson law, arousal affects performance in different ways, depending on the task, with moderate arousal leading to optimal performance. For example, when taking an exam, moderate arousal is best. It's better to just be calm. In general, too little arousal can be disruptive. Too much can tax the body. You're tired and taxed and unable to produce the answers that you know are there. Discuss whether different emotions activate different physiological and brain pattern responses. Similar physiological arousals occur during fear, anger, and sexual arousal. Nonetheless, these emotions feel different. And despite similar arousals, sometimes our facial expressions differ during these three states. For example, people may appear paralyzed with fear or ready to explode with anger. Emotions may also stimulate different facial muscles. During fear, the brow muscles intense. That's a good fear face. During joy, muscles in the cheek and under the eye pull into a smile. It's kind of a frightened smile. Maybe a better smile. Emotions also differ in the brain circuits they use. For example, brain scans show increased activities in the amygdala during fear. Finally, emotions activate different areas of the brain's cortex. The right prefrontal cortex becomes more electrically active as people experience negative emotions, such as disgust. The left frontal lobe shows more activity with positive emotions. All right, so discuss the effectiveness of polygraphs in using body states to detect lies. The polygraph has been around for many years. It measures physiological indicators of emotions. For example, changes in your breathing, cardiovascular activity, and perspiration. Research suggests that if a polygraph experts were the judges, more than 1/3 of the innocent would be declared guilty, and 1/4 of the guilty would be declared innocent. Percentages that are too high to justify its widespread use in business and government. A more effective approach is the guilty knowledge test. Several research teams are exploring new ways to detect a deception. You don't know you're deceived until after you've been deceived. For example, forensic neuroscience. Researchers use the fMRI scans have shown liars' brain activating in places that honest people's brains do not. So expressing emotion. Let's check and see where we are in your handouts. Gender and expressiveness. Male and female film viewers did not differ dramatically in self-reported emotions or physiological responses. I'm just reading from page 3 on your PowerPoint, and you just follow along on your PowerPoint. Culture-specific and culture-universal expressions, and so it gives you 6 different faces on your PowerPoint. The effects of facial expressions. Research on the facial feedback effect. Facial expressions can trigger emotional feelings and signal our body to respond accordingly. There was a research done on depression where they had a placebo, where they had people come in with the placebo as if they were receiving some type of a medication, and they just sat in front of a mirror and they smiled for the 50 minutes that they would spend with a therapist, general talk therapist. And then they had a group of people that came in and actually engaged in talk therapy. What they found out was that the people that came and gazed into a mirror for the 50 minutes and just smiled recovered more readily from depressive states than those that came in and talked to a therapist in just a regular talk therapy. And why did this work? Because emotion creates motion. And so the motion of smiling for that prolonged period of time caused people to laugh. It caused people to laugh hysterically, release endorphin, serotonin, and dopamine, cortisol in the body that causes the body to be okay with feeling better. And so the emotion is created by the facial motion or emotions happening in the body through the response of a smile. A similar behavioral feedback effect, tendency of behavior to influence our own and other thoughts, feelings, and actions. Experience emotions. So we talked a little bit about IZARD's, isolated 10 basic emotions that include physiological and expressive behavior. So these basic emotions, joy, interest, excitement, surprise, sadness, anger, disgust, contempt, fear, shame, and guilt. 2 dimensions that help differentiate emotions: positive versus negative emotions, low versus high arousal. All right, so detecting emotions in others. Describe how we communicate nonverbally. All of us communicate nonverbally as well as verbally. For example, a filmed handshake immediately conveys an outgoing, expressive personality. With a gaze, an averted glance, or a stare, we can communicate intimacy, submission, or dominance. Most people can detect nonverbal cues, and we are especially sensitive to nonverbal threats. Experience contributes to our sensitivity to cues, as studies of abused children demonstrates. Our brains are rather amazing detectors of subtle expressions. For example, a mere 10-second clip of a teacher's voice or a face enabled viewers to assess whether the teacher liked or admired the child or she was addressing. Let's read that again. For example, a mere 10-second clip of a teacher's voice or face enabled viewers to assess whether the teacher liked and admired the child he or she was addressing. Sounds better. Despite our brain's emotion detecting skill, we find it difficult to detect deceiving emotions. And so if you've got somebody who is skilled at manipulating people, then they may produce, let's see, tears, for example. I had a relative that knew how to cry at the drop of a hat. Anytime she wanted to get her way, she would produce real tears and be in a real state of crisis when there was no clear crisis. And when she produced those tears, there was a reward. So people, oh, baby, don't cry. And, oh, come here, I'll give you just a little bit of what you wanted. And just be happy, blah, 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 blah. Learning that at a young age, she grows up to be a young adult. And at the drop of a hat, she can produce tears in order to get empathy from others and to get the desired response that she wants. Let's see. Our brains are rather amazing detectors of subtle expressions. Introverts are better emotion detectors than extroverts, although extroverts are easier to read. Extroverts are those people that gain energy and gain, what's the word I'm looking for? It's going out of my brain. And so extroverts are people who like to talk, who like to engage in society, who feel filled up. I guess that's what I'm looking for. Who feel filled up and energized when they talk to other people, or when they're the life of the party, or when they're engaging with someone else. They feel more connected. Introverts are people who like to go inside to feel filled up. They feel more refreshed or more re-energized when they've had time to seclude themselves from the world and maybe reflect on their day or reflect on whatever they've been working on. They feel more connected that way. Introverted people feel drained when you put them continuously in extroverted situations. And so they want to retreat more readily. And the same with extroverted people. If you put extroverted people in an introverted environment, they may feel more drained because they cannot exert the energy that they need to socialize and be connected. So the absence of gestures, facial expressions, and tones of voice in electronic communication deprives us of an important source of information. Gender, emotion, and nonverbal behavior. Discuss whether the genders differ in their ability to communicate nonverbally. And so we talked a bit about women generally surpass men at reading people's emotions. Women's nonverbal sensitivity helps explain their greater emotional literacy. Their skill at decoding others' emotions may also contribute to the greater emotional responsiveness. When surveyed, women are far more likely than men to describe themselves as empathetic, and they are more likely to express empathy. Women also tend to experience emotional events more deeply with greater brain activation in areas sensitive to emotions. Culture and emotional responses. Explain whether gestures and facial expressions mean the same thing in all cultures. All right, so let's see where you are in your handouts. So you're keeping up with stuff here. All right, on page 5, it talks about experiencing the emotion of anger, consequences of anger, experiencing the emotion of happiness, on page 6 is looking at the stress illness, the predictors of happiness and stress responses. So we're just going to keep going until we catch up here. Although some gestures are culturally determined, facial expressions such as the happiness and anger are common to the world all over. Children's facial expressions, even those of blind children who have never seen a face, are also universal. So happiness and fear are universal facial expressions. It doesn't matter what culture you're from. If you're afraid or if you're happy, someone will be able to recognize that emotion. Charles Darwin suggested that before our ancestors communicated in words, their ability to convey threats, greetings, and submission with facial expressions helped them to survive. Emotional responses may also enhance our survival in other ways. For example, sudden widened eyes enable us to take in more information. Disgust wrinkles the nose, closing it from foul odors. Cultures differ in how much they express emotions. For example, cultures that value individuality display mostly visible emotions. In the Chinese culture, which encourages people to adjust to others, personal emotions are less visibly displayed. Like most physiological events, emotion is best understood as biological, cognitive, and social cultural phenomena. The effects of facial expressions. Describe whether facial expressions influence our feelings. The facial feedback effect indicate that expressions amplify our emotions by activating muscles associated with specific states, and the muscles signify the body to respond as though we were experiencing those states. For examples, students induced to make a frowning expression reported feeling a little angry. So when I'm making that face, remember I talked a little bit about the depression, and when they smiled, they felt happier. But if you looked in the mirror and you frowned consistently, you may feel angry or depressed. Students induced to smile felt happier, found cartoons funnier. Similarly, the behavioral feedback effect shows that if we move our body, emotion is created by motion, as we would when experiencing some emotion. Shuffling around with downcast eyes when we're sad, we are likely to feel that emotion to some degree. Acting as another helps us feel what another feels. And so if you've ever dealt with, let's say, depression, just because we used that as an example earlier, people in a depressed state have a depressed presentation in their body. And so I don't have to ask you, you probably already know that they have drooped eyes, their shoulder is hung down, their head is normally in a down position, their eyes are lowered, the shoulders are lowered. And so all of those physical responses help you to make a better assessment as to the emotion that's going along with that physical presentation. Someone whose shoulders is up and who's smiling and upbeat and just kind of going along with their day, and they're free with their hands and free with their body, you would probably assess that they are pretty happy in that moment. So emotion is created by motion. All right, moving on. Experiencing emotions. Name some basic emotions and describe dimensions that help to differentiate them. All right, so this is where we looked at Izard's investigation, where he talked about joy, excitement, surprise, sadness, anger, disgust, contempt, fear, shame, and guilt. Although other researchers argued with additional emotions, Izard contend that other emotions are combinations of these 10. When psychologists have asked people to report their experiences of different emotions, all seem to place emotions along the dimensions of pleasant, positive versus unpleasant or negative. The emotions valence and high versus low arousal. On the valence and arousal dimensions, terrified is more frightened than afraid, and delighted is happier than happy. All right, anger, experiencing emotion, anger. Identify the causes and consequences of anger. People report that anger is often a response to friends or loved ones' misdeeds, and it is especially common when those acts are willful, unjustified, and avoidable. Blameless annoyances such as foul odors, high temperature, or traffic jams can also make us angry. Anybody got a little road rage? Say, Jesus, take the wheel. Although blowing off steam may temporarily calm an angry person, it may also amplify underlying hostilities, and it may provoke retaliation. The catharsis hypothesis maintains that releasing aggressive energy through action or fantasy reduces anger. Catharsis is when someone is able to, for example, cry. They're able to release tears, or they're able to talk through whatever they're going through at the moment, which gives words to that emotion, and they're able to release some of the pent-up anger and energy that's produced by whatever that thought was. Research has not supported the catharsis hypothesis. Angry outbursts may be reinforcing and therefore habit forming. Let me say that again for people who are prone to angry outbursts. Angry outbursts may be reinforcing and therefore forming a habit that when these things happen to me, this is how I respond. And when I respond this way, then people around me respond a certain way that serves me. And when it serves me and I get what I want, I create a habit of this is how I get my goal. When people are treating me a certain way, I explode in anger. And if I explode in anger, then people backpedal. They stay away. They create distance. And so I get my goal with getting a little bit more respect. But then that's a go-to. Every time I want that type of respect is now I have to be angry and explode at people in order to get that goal. In contrast, anger expressed as non-accusing statement of feeling can benefit relationships by leading to reconciliation rather than retaliation. When retaliation fails, forgiveness can reduce one's anger and its physical response. So forgiveness can reduce one's anger, and it also reduces physical aggression. Practice forgiveness. All right, happiness. Define the feel-good, do-good phenomenon and describe the focus of positive psychology and research. All right, a good mood boosts people's perception of the world and their willingness to help others. The feel-good, do-good phenomenon. Mood-boosting experiences make us more likely to give money, pick up someone, drop papers, volunteer time, and do good deeds. The study of personal control and optimism reflects the new interest in positive psychology. The scientific study of optimal human functioning, although it shares the humanistic psychology and interest in fostering human fulfillment, its origins and methodology are scientific. Positive psychology studies positive emotions, positive character, positive groups, communities, and cultures. After decades of focusing on negative emotions, psychologists who emphasize positive psychology are now actively exploring the causes and consequences of subjective well-being, self-perceived happiness, or life satisfaction. Describe how time, wealth, adaptation, and comparison affect our happiness levels. All right, let's check out our handouts before we move forward. Experience, I'm on page 5 here, experiencing emotion, happiness. States of happiness, we talked about the feel good, do good phenomenon, subjective well-being, self-perceived happiness, and life satisfaction. Experiencing the emotion of happiness, positive psychologists, research areas, 3 pillars of positive psychologists: positive well-being, positive character, communities or culture of happiness. All right. Describe how time, wealth, adaptation, and comparison affect our happiness level. Positive emotions rises over the early to middle part of most days. Although stressful events trigger bad moods, the gloom nearly always lifts by the next day. And so this reminds us that we've got to keep living, keep breathing, that trouble don't last always, that every storm has an end, that every trouble has an end, and brighter days are coming. Times of elation is similarly hard to sustain, and over the long run, our emotional ups and downs tend to balance. Even significant bad events such as serious illness seldom destroy happiness for long. The surprising reality is that we overestimate the duration of emotions and underestimate our own resiliency and capacity to adapt. At a basic level, money helps us to avoid misery. But having it is no guarantee of happiness. There are people that are well-to-do and out emotionally. Sudden increases in wealth, such as winning a state lottery, only increase happiness in the short run. In the long run, increased affluence hardly affects happiness, partly because of the diminishing returns phenomenon. For example, after the last 4 decades, the average U.S. citizen's buying power also tripled, yet average American is no happier. More generally, research indicates that economic growth in affluent countries have not boosted morale or social well-being. Ironically, those who strive hardest for wealth tend to experience lower well-being. What matters more is intimacy, personal growth, and the contribution that we give to the community. Learning to be a servant, learning to serve, brings us happiness. The adaptation level phenomenon describes our tendency to judge various stimuli related to those who have previously experienced. If our income and social prestige increases, we feel initial pleasure. I feel good. As people climb the ladder of success, they mostly compare themselves with who are at or above their current level. This explains why increases in income may do little to increase happiness. Well, money can't buy happiness, but it can buy me the resources to find out what makes me happy. Identify some predictors of happiness. High self-esteem predicts happiness. Close friendships and satisfying relationships, marriages, meaningful religious faith are among the predictors of happiness. Age, gender, parenthood, and physical attractiveness are among the factors related to happiness. Some basic concepts. Identify events that provoke stress responses and describe how we respond and adapt to stressors. All right, so this next chapter is about stress and illness. Stress is just not a stimulus or a response. Rather, it is the process by which we appraise and respond to threatening or challenging events in life. When perceived as challenges, stressors can arouse and motivate us to conquer the problem. When perceived as threats, prolonged stressors can harm and increase the risk of illness. For example, catastrophic floods, hurricanes, and fires can result in significant damage to emotional and physical health. Those who experience significant life changes, such as death of a spouse, divorce, loss of a job, vulnerable diseases, experience a cluster of such crises, puts one even at more risk of higher stress. Daily hassles such as spotty phone connections, long lines at the store, aggravating housemates, and emails or text spams may be the most significant sources of stress. Over time, these little stressors take a toll on our health and well-being. Walter Cannon confirmed that the stress response is part of the unified mind-body system. He observed that in response to stress, the sympathetic nervous system activates the secretion of stress hormones, triggered increased heart rate and respiration, diverts blood from digestion to skeletal muscles, dulls feelings of pain, releases sugar and fat from the body stores, all to prepare the body for either fight or flight. All of these things are happening in your body when you have perceived stress or threats. In addition to this and faster stress response system, a slower system involves a cerebral cortex, stimulating the hypothalamus and the pituitary gland to trigger the release of glucocorticoid stress hormones such as cortisol from the outer part of the adrenal glands. In Hans Seel's General Adaptation Syndrome, this is called GAS, General Adaptation Syndrome, the body's adaptive response to stress is compared at 3 stages. The first phase, we experience an alarmed reaction due to the sudden activation of the sympathetic nervous system. We are alarmed. There is a threat or there is stress. Heart rate increases. Blood is diverted to the skeletal muscles. With our resources mobilized, we then fight the challenge during phase 2, resistance. Temperature, blood pressure, and respiration remain high, and there is a sudden outpouring of stress hormones. If the stress is persistent, if it does not stop, it may eventually deplete our body's reserves during phase 3, exhaustion. We are more vulnerable to illness or sicknesses, in extreme cases, collapse and death. People deal with stress in various ways. It's often been said that stress is a killer. One study found the shortening of telomeres, I'm pretty sure I'm not saying that right, telomeres, in women who suffered enduring stress as caregivers for children with serious disorders. A common response to a loved one's death is to withdraw, thus conserving energy. We're going inward. A more common stress response in women is tend and befriend. Facing stress, men more often than women tend to withdraw socially, turn to alcohol, or become aggressive. Stress and vulnerability to disease. Describe how stress makes us vulnerable to disease. All right. Prolonged stress increases our risk of serious illness. By studying our emotions and our personalities influence our risk of disease. The effects of stress and the promotion of healthier living, health psychologists contribute to behavioral medicines and the interdisciplinary field that integrates behavioral health and medical knowledge. Our understanding of the impact of stress on resistance to disease has fostered the development of psychoneuroimmunology, which studies how physiological, neural, and endocrine processes together affect our immune system and health. When the immune system functions properly, It helps you by isolating and destroying bacteria, viruses, and invaders. There's 4 types of cells are active in the search and destroy mission. All right, so you've got the lymphocytes are important in fighting bacterial infections. You have the B, lymphocytes, T, lymphocytes. They fight cancer cells, viruses, and foreign substances. 2 other agents of the immune system are the macrophage and the natural killer cells. When animals are physically restrained, given unavoidable electric shocks, and subjected to noise, crowd, cold water, social defeat, and maternal separation, they become susceptible to disease. Their systems are breaking down. Studies suggest that stress similarly depresses the human immune system, making us more vulnerable to illnesses. The immune system can err in 2 directions. Overacting, it may attack the body's own tissues. Or underreacting, it may allow the virus to erupt. Stress and negative emotions correlate with the progression of HIV, infection to AIDS, and with the speed of decline in those affected. Efforts to reduce stress also help somewhat to control disease. And this is important to understand, is all of the efforts that you use to control stress helps to decrease the propensity of having some disease. And so efforts like exercise, eating healthier, finding out what foods are antioxidants that help your body to thrive when it's up under stress, getting enough sleep can help to thwart off diseases. Educational initiatives, bereavement support groups, cognitive therapy, relaxation training, exercise programs that reduce stress all have positive consequences for people who were HIV positive. Although stress does not produce cancer cells, some researchers have reported that people are at risk for cancer a year or so after experiencing depression, helplessness, or bereavement. A large Swedish study found that people with a history of workplace stress have greater risk of colon cancer than those who report no such problems. Although a relaxed, hopeful attitude may enhance the body's natural defenses against a few proliferating cancer cells, merely maintaining a determined attitude is not likely to derail the powerful biological forces at work in advanced cancer or AIDS. So managing your stress is huge. Learn how to do it now. As a student or as a young adult, learn how to do it now so that when you reach life stressors, things that are unavoidable, things that are uncontrollable, things that seem outside of your reach, then you already have some tools in your toolbox on how to deal with them. Prayer is a great stress reliever. It reminds us that God is bigger than our problem, and it helps us to put the Bible in the forefront of our view and let all the external problems be on the outlier of life, and so that we see our problems through the Word of God. Explain why some of us are more prone than others to coronary heart disease. Okay, stress can increase the risk of coronary heart disease, the leading cause of death in North America. It has been linked with the competitive, hard-driven, impatient, time-conscious, super-motivated, verbally aggressive, and easily angered type A personality. Oh my. Many people have this type A personalities. Is more prone in, let's see, police officers, firemen, people that are in high stress situations that have to make a decision, develop that type A personality. Military develop that type A personality. The toxic core of type A is a negative. The toxic core of the type A personality is the harboring of the negative emotions, especially the anger associated with aggressively reactive temperament. Under stress, the sympathetic nervous system of the type A person redistributes blood flow to the muscles and away from internal organs, such as the liver, which removes cholesterol and fat from the blood. The resulting excess cholesterol later gets deposited around the heart muscle. The more easygoing type B personality is less physiologically reactive when harassed or given a difficult challenge and less susceptible to coronary heart disease. Pessimism and depression also have a toxic effect on a person's health. Both heart disease and depression may result when chronic stress triggers persistent inflammation. People with another type, type D, suppress their negative emotions to avoid social disapproval. In one analysis, having a type D personality significantly increased risk for mortality and non-fatal heart attacks. All right, lastly, well, second to the last. We've got one more to do. Let's see where you are in your handouts here. All right, we went to stress and heart disease is what we just covered. That was on page 7 in your handouts. Stress and heart disease continues on page 8. Personal control, learned helplessness, page 8. Depleting and strengthening self-control. Okay, so you're following along with your PowerPoints. We're coming to coping with stress. All right. Identify 2 ways that people try to alleviate stress. So we cope with stress by finding emotional, cognitive, and behavioral ways to alleviate it. Through problem-focused coping, we attempt to alleviate stress by changing the stressor or the way we interact with the stressor. One of the things I tell people is we can't control what happens to us. Life happens to all of us. But we can control how we feel about those things that are happening. We tend to use problem-focused strategies when we think we can change the situation, or at least change ourselves to be more capable or adaptable in those situations. We tend to use emotion-focused coping when we believe we cannot change a situation. For example, we may attempt to gain emotional distance from damaging, discontinued relationships because it helps us to cope with the feelings coming from that relationship. Explain how we perceive lack of control. Explain how perceived lack of control can affect health. All right, for some animals and people, a series of uncontrollable events create a learned helplessness.
My web search turned something up for Hey Series of Anchor 12.
I'm not sure why Siri is talking. All right, so learned helplessness. I just saw this in your handout, so I want to look at it. Uncontrollable bad events, perceived lack of control, generalized helplessness behavior. Why does perceived loss of control predict health problems? Losing control produces rising stress hormones. Blood pressure levels increase. Immune responses drop. Increasing control has noticeably improved health and morale in prison and nursing home studies. Tyranny of choice can create information overload. All right. In examining our interactions with our environment, social cognitive psychologist emphasizes our sense of personal control. That is, whether we learn to see ourselves as controlling or as being controlled by the environment. And you can ask yourself this question in any environment. Am I being controlled by this environment, or am I controlling this environment? People who perceive an internal rather than an external locus of control achieve more in school and work, enjoy better health, and more independent and less depressed. And so we did the locus of control through that online study earlier. And if your locus of control was a lower number, it showed that you were more in tune to your own self-awareness. And if it was a higher number, which says you're more in tune to the external factors that influence how you feel. Describe how self-control can be depleted and explain why it is important to build this strength. All right, so this is important. Self-control is a gift of the Spirit. We need self-control. Check out Galatians. Self-control, the ability to control impulses and delay short-term gratification for longer-term rewards, predict good health, higher income, better grades. Self-control is constantly changing, like a muscle. Self-control weakens after use, recovers after rest, grows stronger with exercise. So I'm going to repeat that because that may be good knowledge for someone. Self-control weakens after use, recovers after rest, and grows stronger with exercise. These muscles grow because we're using them, exercising them. Strength and self-control improves people's performance on laboratory tests and improves their self-management of eating, drinking, anger, and household chores. Describe how an optimistic outlook affects health and longevity. Optimism and pessimism influence stress vulnerabilities. Optimist perceives more control, cope better with stressful events, and enjoy better health. Compared with pessimists, optimists report less fatigue, have fewer coughs, aches, and pains, and responds to stress with smaller increases in blood pressure. Optimism runs in families. One genetic marker of optimism is a gene that enhances the social bonding hormone oxytocin. Describe how social supports promote health. Feeling liked, affirmed, and encouraged by intimate friends and families promotes both happiness and health. It's good to feel liked. It's good when people like you. It's good when people show that they like you. It feels good, and it helps us feel good about ourselves. That's not no rocket science. We all know that. Compared with those who have few social ties, people supported by close relationships are less likely to die prematurely. Carefully controlled studies also indicate that people in low conflict marriages live longer. Decide your mate carefully. Healthier lives than the unmarried. Social support strengthens immune functioning, calms the cardiovascular system, and lowers blood pressure and stress hormones. Close relationships provide an opportunity to confide painful feelings. Reducing stress. Discuss the effectiveness of aerobic exercise as a way to manage stress and improve well-being. Aerobic exercise, sustained exercise that increases heart and lung fitness can reduce stress. So some prolonged exercise, which gets your heart rates up to a certain level for any prolonged period of time, helps you to feel more physically fit and also gives you more emotional health. It strengthens the heart, increases blood flow, helps the blood vessels open, and lowers blood pressure and blood pressure reactions to stress. Research has linked aerobic exercise to high levels of neurotransmitters that boost moods and enhances cognitive abilities. And it may foster neurogenesis. Describe the ways in which relaxation and meditation may influence stress and health. All right, biofeedback, a system of recording, amplifying, and feeding back information about subtle physiological responses enable people to control specific physiological responses. Research suggests that biofeedback works best on tension headaches. I need some of that right now. For example, research indicates that relaxation procedures help alleviate headaches, hypertension, anxiety, and insomnia. Those experiencing meditation assume a comfortable position, breathe deeply, relax their muscles, close their eyes, and focus on simple, repeated phrases. Research on mindfulness meditation found that it is associated with improved immune functioning, reduced anxiety and depression, and coping. Mindfulness exercises would be what we do when we open up our class. I have you breathe in and breathe out. And if you're doing a mindfulness exercises in a counseling session, we would do those breathing exercises for about 3 to 5 minutes, just breathing into the count of 4, holding to the count of 4, breathing out to the count of 4, holding to the count of 4. Is called 4 square breathing, which allows air into the lungs and for the lungs to fill up fully with a deep breath, which we rarely take in our day. And it increases oxygen to the brain, which allows us to think more clearly and be more on our task with responding and encoding data. Mindfulness practices have also been linked to reductions in sleep problems, cigarette use, binged eating, and alcohol and other substance use disorders. How does it work? Correlation and experimental studies offer 3 explanations. Mindfulness strengthens connections among the regions of the brain, activate brain regions associated with more reflective awareness, and calms brain activities in emotional situations. Describe the faith factor and offer some possible explanations for the link between faith and health. All right, this is our last piece. Research indicates that religious active people live longer than those who are not religious. Investigators who attempt to explain this faith factor have isolated 3 intervening variables. Number 1, religiously active people have healthier lifestyles. For example, they smoke and drink less. Also, religion promotes self-control. Of course it does. 2, faith communities provide social supports, networks, and often encourage healthy marriages, which when people is linked with better health and longer lifespans, they increase healthier living. 3, attendance at religious services is often accompanied by a coherent worldwide sense of hope for the future, feelings of acceptance, and a relaxed meditative state. These may enhance positive emotions and immune functioning and decrease feelings of stress and anxiety. When you leave a church service on a Sunday or Wednesday or Friday or whenever you attend, you should feel a greater connection to God, a greater connection to people, a greater connection to your purpose in this earth, which helps you feel better about yourself. And so this is our study on emotion, stress, and health. And on Wednesday, we will watch a few videos that bring this home and answer a few questions that have to do with this study. For example, going back to our fact versus falsehood. All right, so the question that I started this off with was some emotional responses involve no conscious thinking. And the answer to that is true. The polygraph has proven to be extremely effective in detecting lies. What do you think the answer is? We talked about how there's some discrepancies in those polygraph tests, and there's a large number of guilty people that would come up innocent if the judges were the polygraph experts. Introverts are superior to extroverts at reading other emotions. That came out as true. Introverts are more empathetic and are more in tune to self, have a lower locus of control. Facial expressions associated with emotions such as happiness and fear are the same all over the world. What do you think? We talked about facial expressions such as happiness, anger, fear, and how they are universal responses. So that would be true. Occasionally, blowing off steam seems to reduce anger and aggression in the long run. What do you think? Blowing off steam seems to reduce anger and aggression in the long run. That would be false. We talked about how the pattern of blowing off steam or becoming aggressive and using that pattern of response to get what you want becomes an adaptive pattern. That if that's a pattern that serves you, you will frequently go to that to get the results that you're after. Kidney dialysis patients report being just as happy as healthy non-patients. This is true. Compared with others, pessimists are more than twice as likely to develop heart disease. This is true. We talked about the difference between optimism and pessimism. Researchers agree that stress creates cancer. This is false. They can't prove that stress creates cancer. Only 1 in 4 people in the United States exercise for at least half an hour or 5 or more days a week. This is true. I'm always making a pledge that next week I'm going to get on that exercise and I'm going to do it consistently, and next week never truly comes. Religious faith and health show a strong positive correlation. What do you think as a Christian believer attending chapel weekly and attending church services and working in the ministry? Does it increase your health? Does it help you feel happier, connected? Does it give you insight about your future? And if your future is bright, do you feel better? So the answer to that question is true. All right, psychology class, this is your chapter 12 review, and we will pick up on Wednesday and probably watch a few videos that bring this information home. And I'm looking for a interactive conversation with you on Wednesday. So God bless. Have a great week.